The whistle at Consolidated number 9 blew at 6 in the morning, and I walked out of that mine shaft the same way I'd walked out 1,000 times before, covered in coal dust, ears ringing from the continuous miners, lungs thick with that particular taste of rock and machine oil that never quite washes out, no matter how many showers you take. October had settled into the hollers proper by then, painting the ridges in fire colors, and even through my exhaustion I noticed the way the morning light caught the mist rising off the creek beds. Beautiful country. My grandfather used to say God made these mountains first, before he figured out how to do it right, and that's why they're so wild. I believed him then. I believe something different now. I drove the winding road back to my cabin in a half-trance, the way you do when you've worked 12 hours underground and your body knows the route better than your mind does. My truck, a '98 Ford with more rust than paint, rattled over the potholes and washboards like an old friend complaining about the weather. The cabin sat at the end of a logging road about 4 miles off the main route, backed up against a steep hollow that climbed into national forest land. My grandfather built the place in 1952, and my father was born in the back bedroom, and I'd spent every summer of my childhood learning these woods until I knew them better than I knew the streets of any town. Boone was waiting on the porch when I pulled up, his tail already going, that German shepherd grin spreading across his face. He'd been with me 3 years by then, ever since my cousin Marcus washed him out of the state police K-9 program. Too friendly, Marcus had said. Can't get him mean enough for suspect work. That was fine by me. I'd had enough mean in my life. What with the divorce and everything that came before it. Boone was loyal and smart, and he didn't ask questions about why I sometimes sat on the porch until 2 in the morning, just drinking coffee and staring at the dark. He just sat with me, his warm weight against my leg, and that was enough. Hey, boy. I scratched behind his ears as I climbed out of the truck. You keep the place safe? He woofed once, low and happy, and followed me inside. The cabin wasn't much. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that still had the wood stove my grandmother cooked on, a living room with a stone fireplace I'd rebuilt myself after the mortar started crumbling. The walls were rough-hewn logs that my grandfather had cut from this very hollow back when a man could still do that without paperwork and permits. I had electricity courtesy of a line the coal company ran up here in the 60s, and running water from a well that had never gone dry in 70 years. No internet, no cell service worth mentioning. I liked it that way. After 12 hours in the constant noise of the mine, the silence was a mercy. I showered off the worst of the coal dust, ate a plate of eggs and toast while Boone watched with hopeful eyes, then collapsed into bed with the curtains drawn. The rhythm of working nights had become second nature over the past 15 years. Sleep till noon, run the dogs, check my hunting setups, maybe drive into town for groceries or a beer at Dale's place. My ex-wife Laura used to say I was more comfortable with hounds than humans, and she wasn't wrong. The dogs didn't care that I wasn't ambitious, that I didn't want to move to Charleston or Lexington and find work that didn't involve crawling through rock seams 300 feet underground. The dogs just wanted to run, and I understood that. I woke around 1 in the afternoon, the way I always did, and lay there for a few minutes, listening to the cabin creak and settle. Boone was sprawled at the foot of the bed, twitching through some dream where he was probably chasing rabbits. Outside, I could hear the squirrels arguing in the hickory trees and the distant call of a pileated woodpecker working on a dead oak. Normal sounds, comfortable sounds. The soundtrack of my whole life, really. The phone rang as I was pouring my first cup of coffee. The landline, because that's all that worked out here reliably. "Dante, that you?" Earl's voice crackled through the line, thick with his Kentucky accent. "Last I checked." "You coming to poker on Thursday? Jimmy's wife is out of town, so we can play at his place." "Probably." I sipped my coffee, watching Boone stretch and yawn at my feet. "Who's in?" "Me, Jimmy, Pete, maybe Carl if his back's doing better." "You could bring some of that moonshine your uncle makes." "I could." "That means you will." Earl laughed. That wheezy sound he made when the black lung was flaring up. We'd worked together at Consolidated for 12 years, and I'd watched the cough get worse every season. "See you Thursday." The connection cut out before I could say goodbye, which was normal for the hollow. I finished my coffee and pulled on my boots, checking the weather through the kitchen window. Clear skies, temperature in the mid-50s, perfect for running the coon hounds through the ridges. I kept 2 of them, Rusty and May, in a kennel behind the cabin, but lately I'd been letting them rest more. Rusty was getting old, 12 years and slowing down, and May had thrown a litter in the spring that took a lot out of her. Boone pressed against my leg as I grabbed my hunting vest. "Yeah, boy, you're coming. Don't worry." We walked out into that October afternoon, and I remember thinking how perfect everything was. The light slanting through the trees, golden and thick. The smell of fallen leaves and wood smoke from someone's chimney up the hollow. Boone ranging ahead of me on the logging road, his nose working the air, tail high and happy. I was 34 years old, and I'd lived in these mountains my whole life, and I thought I knew every danger they held. I didn't know a goddamn thing. We followed the logging road about 2 miles up toward the ridge, where I had 3 tree stands set up for the upcoming deer season. I'd been hunting these woods since I was 8 years old, when my grandfather first put his old .30-30 in my hands and taught me how to breathe through a shot. I could walk these trails blindfolded, knew every creek crossing and rock outcropping and hollow tree where the raccoons liked to den. This was my country, my blood and bone, and I moved through it the way you move through your own home in the dark. The first stand looked good. No damage, the ladder still solid, clear shooting lanes in 3 directions. I climbed up to check the seat and spent a few minutes just sitting there watching the woods below. Boone lay at the base of the tree, patient as always. Squirrels chased each other through the canopy. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, hunting the meadow beyond the tree line. I remember exactly when it changed. One moment the woods were alive with sound, insects humming, birds calling, the constant background rustle of small animals going about their business. The next moment, nothing. Absolute silence, the kind that makes your ears ring because they're straining to hear something, anything. It happened so fast that I thought at first I'd gone deaf, that maybe something had burst in my inner ear without warning. Then I looked down and saw Boone. He was standing rigid at the base of the tree, every muscle locked, his hackles raised in a ridge from his shoulders to his tail. I'd had that dog 3 years and worked with him almost every day, and I'd never seen him like that. His lips were pulled back from his teeth, not in a snarl, but in something more primal, an expression I'd only seen in pictures of wolves facing down a threat. A growl was building in his chest, so low I felt it more than heard it. "Boone?" I said, and my voice came out strange in that unnatural quiet. "What is it, boy?" He didn't look at me. His eyes were fixed on something deeper in the trees, something I couldn't see from my elevated position. I scanned the woods below, looking for movement, for the shape of a bear or a big cat. We had both in these mountains, though sightings were rare. Nothing, just trees and shadows and that horrible pressing silence. The smell hit me a few seconds later. I've been around animals my whole life. Dogs, horses, cattle, wild game of every kind. I know what they smell like. Healthy and sick, living and dead. This was something else. There was a musk to it, like wet dog, but sharper, more intense, layered over something copper bright that made me think of the killing floor at the processing plant where I'd worked one summer in high school. And underneath that, a rot sweetness that triggered something deep in my hindbrain, something that made my hands want to reach for a weapon even before my conscious mind understood why. "Bear," I said out loud, trying to convince myself, got to be a bear, maybe a sick one. Boone didn't move, didn't acknowledge my voice at all. The growl in his chest grew louder, and I saw his whole body trembling with the effort of holding himself still. Every instinct that dog had was telling him to run, and he was fighting it because I was there, because I hadn't given him the command. I climbed down from the tree stand slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The silence pressed against my ears like water pressure, and every crack of bark under my boots sounded impossibly loud. When I reached the ground, Boone immediately pushed himself against my leg, hard enough to almost knock me off balance. His eyes were still fixed on that spot in the trees, and now I was looking too, searching the shadows for whatever had turned my steady, fearless dog into this shivering, growling mess. Nothing. I couldn't see a goddamn thing. We walked back to the cabin faster than I'd walked anywhere in years, and Boone stayed so close to my leg that I nearly tripped over him twice. The silence followed us for maybe half a mile before the normal sounds started creeping back in, a tentative cricket, then another, then the rusty gate call of a jay in the distance. By the time we reached the porch, the woods sounded almost normal again. But Boone wouldn't stop staring back at the tree line, and when I finally coaxed him inside, he went straight to the corner farthest from the windows and curled up there, watching the door. I told myself it was a bear, had to be a bear, maybe one with mange or an infection that made it smell wrong and act strange. I'd heard of rabid bears coming down from the high country, though I'd never seen one myself. That night I ate dinner with my rifle propped against the table and all the doors locked, which I never did, and I checked on Boone 4 times before I finally managed to fall asleep. The dreams were bad. I don't remember them clearly, just impressions of running, of something huge behind me, of yellow eyes watching from dark places. When the alarm went off for my shift at the mine, I was more tired than I'd been when I went to bed. Over the next week, I looked for rational explanations. I walked those woods in daylight with Boone reluctant at my side, and I found nothing. No bear sign, no scat, no claw marks on the trees. What I did find bothered me more than if I'd discovered a den of angry black bears. The deer had gone strange. I saw a herd of 8 does bunched up at the edge of a meadow, so tight together they were almost touching, and they bolted at my approach, like I was a pack of wolves rather than a single man with a dog. Deer don't herd like that. Not in these woods. Not in October when they should be spread out browsing for acorns. They were scared of something, and it wasn't me. I mentioned the silence to Earl at the mine, keeping my voice casual, like it was just an odd thing I'd noticed. He laughed, that wheezing sound that always made me wince. The hollow's always been touched, Dante. You know that. My grandma used to say the little people lived up in those rocks, and you shouldn't go bothering them after dark. I'm serious, Earl, but it was dead quiet. No insects, no birds, nothing. So? Animals get weird sometimes. Remember 2 years ago when all the squirrels disappeared for a month? Came back eventually. He shrugged and went back to his lunch. You're spending too much time alone up there, that's your problem. Maybe he was right. The divorce had hit me harder than I wanted to admit, and I'd isolated myself, more than was probably healthy. Laura used to say I was half feral even when we were married, and being alone had just made it worse. Maybe I was imagining things, letting the solitude play tricks on my mind. Then I found my trail cameras. I had 4 of them set up around the property, 1 near the logging road, 1 by the creek crossing, 2 along the trails where the deer moved through in the mornings. They were good cameras, the kind that hunters use, motion activated with infrared capability for night shots. I checked them every few days, partly to scout for the upcoming season and partly because I liked seeing what wandered through the hollow when I wasn't around. 3 of the 4 were destroyed, not knocked down. I'd had that happen before with bears curious about the strange object strapped to a tree. These were shattered, plastic housings cracked open, circuits exposed and ripped apart. The SD cards were gone from all 3. Not damaged, not corrupted. Gone, like something had opened the cameras and specifically removed the memory before destroying the rest. The 4th camera, the one nearest the cabin, was untouched, but when I checked its card, I found nothing but black frames. 47 photos of absolute darkness, triggered by motion I couldn't see. I stood there in the October afternoon holding the pieces of my destroyed camera and felt the first real thread of fear coil through my gut. Teenagers, I told myself. Meth heads from over the ridge, maybe. The ones who'd been cooking in an old trailer until the state police found them last spring. They could have done this. They could have been paranoid about being filmed, decided to smash anything that might catch them doing something illegal. But teenagers would have smashed all 4 cameras, not left one untouched, and they wouldn't have carefully removed the SD cards first, and they wouldn't have left no footprints, no cigarette butts, no sign at all that any human being had been anywhere near those trees. I bought new cameras in town and didn't tell anyone what happened to the old ones. The next few days passed in an uneasy rhythm. I worked my shifts at the mine, came home, walked the dogs in daylight only. Boone had gotten worse, not better. He refused to go past the tree line once the sun started getting low, and twice I had to physically drag him down the logging road when he planted his feet and started that low growling again. The other dogs noticed it too. Rusty, old and usually unflappable, started howling at night, long, mournful sounds that made my skin prickle. May wouldn't leave her kennel even to eat, and I finally just brought her food inside and let her curl up by the wood stove, where she lay trembling and watching the windows. My neighbor Mabel stopped by one afternoon, walking up from her place a mile down the hollow. She was 73 years old and had lived in these mountains her whole life. Tough as hickory and twice as stubborn, she had a shotgun over her shoulder and a look on her face that I'd never seen before. "My chickens won't come out of the coop," she said without preamble. "Been 4 days now. They're laying in there, eating in there, but they won't set foot outside even when I open the door." "Something spooked them?" Something's been spooking everything. She squinted at me, her eyes sharp despite her years. You noticed it too, I can tell. I hesitated, not sure how much to say. Woods have been quiet. Animals acting strange. It's the government, Mabel said firmly. They're testing something up at the old radar station, frequencies or chemicals or some such. Makes the animals go crazy. Maybe, I said, though I didn't believe it. You keep that dog of yours close. She nodded toward Boone, who was pressed against my leg watching the tree line again. He's got good instincts. Better than ours. She left and I watched her walk back down the hollow, her shotgun glinting in the afternoon light. I thought about her chickens, refusing to leave their coop. I thought about the deer, bunched together and terrified. I thought about Boone, and Rusty howling at nothing, and May trembling by my stove. Something was out there. Something all the animals knew about. Something they could sense in ways I couldn't. Something that had destroyed my cameras and left no trace. That moved through the woods without making a sound. That smelled like copper and rot and wet animal musk. My rational mind kept insisting there was an explanation. A sick bear, a mountain lion, something ordinary if unusual. But the deeper part of me, the part that my grandfather had tuned to these woods through decades of hunting and living close to the wild, that part knew better. That night I sat on my porch with my rifle across my knees, Boone pressed against my leg, and watched the darkness gather in the trees. The moon was about 3/4 full, bright enough to cast shadows, and the hollow had that silver and black quality that I usually found peaceful. Not that night. That night, every shadow seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at it, and the silence between cricket songs stretched too long, and twice I raised my rifle at nothing before forcing myself to lower it again. Around 11, Boone went rigid against my leg. His growl started, that low, terrible sound I'd learned to dread, and his eyes fixed on a point maybe 50 yards into the tree line where the logging road curved out of sight. I looked where he was looking, my finger on the trigger guard, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. 2 points of light, yellow-green, reflecting the moonlight, or maybe generating their own glow, I couldn't tell. They were 8 feet off the ground, maybe more, in a spot where no eyes should be. Not a bear, not standing on its hind legs, because even a big black bear wouldn't have eyes that far up. Not a cat in a tree, because there was no tree there, just the empty space where the road curved. The eyes didn't blink. They didn't move. They just watched, steady and patient, and I watched back, my rifle half raised, my breath coming in short gasps I couldn't control. Then they were gone, not moving away, not dipping down like something turning to leave. Just gone, there 1 second and not there the next, like someone had flipped a switch. I sat on that porch until dawn and I didn't see them again. But Boone wouldn't stop growling until the sun crested the ridge, and when I finally went inside, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely lock the door. Something was watching me from those woods, and it knew I had seen it. I didn't sleep that day. I tried, God knows I tried, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw those yellow-green points of light hovering in the darkness, patient and unblinking, watching me from a height that made no sense. I lay in bed with the curtains drawn and the rifle propped against the nightstand, and Boone curled up so close to me that I could feel his heartbeat against my ribs. His heart was racing even in the thin sleep he managed, and every few minutes he'd twitch and whimper like something was chasing him through his dreams. Around 2 in the afternoon, I gave up pretending. I made coffee strong enough to strip paint and sat at the kitchen table with a notepad, trying to think through what I'd seen like a rational human being. The eyes had been 8 feet up, maybe more. I wrote that down. They'd been yellow-green, reflective. I wrote that down too. They hadn't blinked, hadn't moved, and then they'd simply vanished. No sound of movement, no rustling in the brush, nothing. Just there. And then not there. A bear standing on its hind legs could get maybe 7 feet tall if it was a big one. But I'd seen bears stand before, and they didn't hold still like that. They swayed, shifted their weight, dropped back down after a few seconds. And their eyes didn't glow that color. Bear eyes reflected red or orange in light. Not that sickly yellow-green. A mountain lion in a tree, maybe. But there was no tree where I'd seen those eyes. I knew that stretch of road like I knew my own hands. The nearest branch that could support any weight was 20 feet from where those eyes had been. I wrote down, mountain lion anyway, because I wanted there to be an answer. I wanted this to be something I could understand, something that belonged in the world I thought I knew. The phone rang around 3, making me jump so badly I knocked my coffee cup off the table. It shattered on the floor, and Boone scrambled to his feet, hackles raised, before he realized it was just me being a damn fool. Dante? Earl's voice came through the line, scratchy and concerned. You okay? You sound like hell. Fine, I said automatically, just tired. You missed your shift last night. Bobby had to cover for you. Foreman's pissed. I stared at the phone in my hand, trying to process what he was saying. I'd worked yesterday, hadn't I? No, I'd sat on the porch all night with my rifle, watching those eyes watch me, and then I'd tried to sleep and failed, and somewhere in there I'd completely lost track of what day it was. The mine, my shift. I'd just not shown up. Shit, I said. Earl, I'm sorry. Something happened and I lost track. Something happened? His voice sharpened. You in trouble? You need me to come up there? For a wild moment, I almost said yes. Come up here, bring your gun, help me figure out what the hell is watching me from the woods. But I could already hear how that would sound. Could already see the look on Earl's face when I tried to explain about the eyes in the darkness. The silence that wasn't natural, the smell of copper and rot. He'd think I'd finally cracked, that the divorce and the isolation had pushed me over some edge I couldn't climb back from. No, I said, no, I'm fine. Just didn't sleep well. I'll call the foreman, explain it was a one-time thing. Earl was quiet for a moment. Dante, you sure you're okay? You've been acting strange lately, asking about weird stuff, the silence and all that. If you need to talk to someone, I'm fine, Earl. There's no shame in it. My cousin went to one of those counselors after his wife passed. Said it helped a lot. I appreciate it, I said, and I meant it, even though I knew I couldn't take him up on it. What would I tell a counselor? That I was afraid of something in the woods, something I couldn't name or describe, something that my dog sensed better than I did? They'd have me on pills inside of a week, and maybe that would help and maybe it wouldn't, but it wouldn't change the fact that something was out there, something real. After Earl hung up, I called the mine and groveled my way through an apology that the foreman accepted with ill grace. Then I put on my boots, grabbed my rifle, and went outside. The afternoon was beautiful. Clear skies, temperature in the low 60s. The kind of October day that usually made me grateful to live in these mountains. I stood on the porch and looked at the tree line 50 yards away and felt nothing but dread. Boone pressed against my leg, his tail low, and I could feel the tension vibrating through his body like a plucked string. "Come on, boy," I said. "We're going to figure this out." He didn't want to go. I had to clip his leash to his collar, something I almost never did, and even then he hung back, his claws digging into the porch boards. But he was a good dog, trained to follow commands, even when every instinct screamed against it. And eventually he let me lead him down the steps and across the yard toward the logging road. In daylight, the woods looked normal. More than normal, they looked beautiful, the way they always did in fall, the maples burning red and the oaks going gold and the hickories dropping their leaves in slow spirals. Squirrels chattered in the branches, and somewhere nearby a woodpecker was working on a dead tree, and I could hear the creek running over rocks about a quarter mile to the east. Normal sounds. Peaceful sounds. But Boone walked stiff-legged at my side, his head swiveling constantly, his nose working the air like he was trying to track something I couldn't smell. And when we reached the curve in the road where I'd seen the eyes, he stopped dead and wouldn't go another step. I looked at the spot carefully, studying the ground, the underbrush, the trees on either side. The road surface was hard-packed dirt and gravel, not great for tracks, but there should have been something. Disturbed leaves, broken branches, the kind of sign any large animal would leave if it had stood in one place for any length of time. I found nothing. The forest floor was undisturbed. A carpet of fallen leaves that looked like it hadn't been touched since they came down from the branches. No tracks, no scat, no fur caught on bark or thorns. Nothing. I expanded my search, walking a slow spiral outward from the spot while Boone stayed rooted to the road, watching me with desperate eyes. 20 feet out, 30, 50. I checked every tree trunk for claw marks, every patch of soft ground for prints. I found deer tracks, squirrel diggings, the three-toed mark of a wild turkey. I found nothing else. "There's nothing here," I said out loud, and my voice sounded strange in my own ears, too loud, too desperate for reassurance. "Whatever it was, it's gone." Boone whined, a high, thin sound I'd never heard him make before, and I looked at him and saw the white showing around his eyes. We went back to the cabin. That night, I didn't sit on the porch. I locked all the doors, checked all the windows, and settled into the living room with Boone and my rifle and every light in the house blazing. I told myself I was being smart, being cautious, not giving whatever was out there a clear view of me silhouetted against the porch light. The truth was simpler and harder to admit. I was afraid to go outside after dark. I must have dozed off sometime after midnight because the next thing I knew, Boone was on his feet and growling, and the clock on the wall said 3:47 a.m. The growl was that same low, terrible sound from before, the one that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his chest, and his whole body was oriented toward the front windows, rigid and trembling. I grabbed the rifle and moved to the wall beside the window, staying out of the line of sight. The curtains were drawn, but I'd left a gap between them, maybe an inch, enough to see out without being too exposed. I pressed my eye to that gap and looked out at the front yard, washed in the silver light of the moon that had risen while I slept. Nothing moved. The yard was empty, the tree line dark and still. I was about to let out my breath, about to convince myself that Boone was jumping at shadows, when I saw them. The eyes. They were back in exactly the same spot as before, that curve in the road where the logging track bent out of sight. Yellow-green points of light, reflecting the moonlight, or maybe generating their own glow, steady and unblinking, and watching my cabin with a patience that made my skin crawl. 8 feet up, maybe 9. Too high for anything that should exist in these woods. I raised the rifle without thinking, bringing the scope to my eye, trying to get a better look at whatever was attached to those eyes. The scope was good. A Leupold 3 to 9 times 40 that my father had given me before he died. And in the moonlight it gathered enough ambient light to show me the shadows between the trees. I couldn't see anything. The eyes were there, clear and bright in the scope's field of view, but around them was just darkness. No shape, no outline, nothing to suggest what kind of creature they belonged to. It was like the eyes were floating in the air, detached from any body, watching me with an intelligence I could feel even across the 50 yards of empty space. Then the eyes moved. Not side to side, not up and down, but forward, toward me. Slow, deliberate, like whatever owned them knew I was watching and wanted me to see it coming. I tracked them with the rifle scope, my finger on the trigger, and I watched those yellow-green points of light glide closer through the darkness, still 8 feet off the ground, still attached to nothing I could see. 20 yards out, they stopped. They just hung there, those eyes, at the edge of where my porch light reached, where the illumination from my windows pushed back the dark, watching, waiting, and I realized with a cold certainty that it could see me. Through the gap in the curtains, through the scope of my rifle, it knew exactly where I was and what I was doing. It was letting me watch it, letting me know that the watching went both ways. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Me with my eye pressed to the rifle scope, those eyes hovering at the edge of the light. 5 minutes? 10? My hands started cramping from the grip I had on the stock, and my legs began to shake from the awkward position I was holding, but I couldn't look away. I was afraid that if I blinked, if I moved, it would be on me before I could react. Boone was pressed against my leg, growling continuously, a vibration I could feel through my jeans. His body heat was the only thing that felt real, the only anchor to a world that still made sense. I focused on that warmth, that familiar pressure, and I tried to make my brain work through the fear. Shoot it, part of me said. Whatever it is, put a bullet through those eyes and end this. But another part of me, a older and more primitive part, whispered that shooting would be a mistake, that I didn't know what it was or how fast it could move or whether a bullet would do anything at all. That making it angry might be the last thing I ever did. The eyes blinked. In 3 years of watching those eyes, that was the first time I saw them blink. A slow, deliberate closing and opening, like a cat acknowledging a mouse it wasn't quite ready to eat yet. And then they were gone, vanishing in that same impossible way, there one instant and not there the next. I stood at that window until dawn, rifle raised, watching the empty space where those eyes had been. Boone stayed with me, pressed so close I could feel his heartbeat against my leg, and together we watched the darkness lighten into gray and then into gold as the sun climbed over the ridge. When I finally lowered the rifle, my arms were trembling so badly I could barely control them. The next morning I drove into town. I didn't have a plan, exactly. I just couldn't stay in that cabin any longer. Couldn't stand the weight of the woods pressing in around me, couldn't shake the feeling that those eyes were still watching even in daylight. I left Boone in the truck, windows cracked, and walked into Dale's place like a man looking for answers in the bottom of a bottle. It wasn't even 10 in the morning, but Dale's was the kind of establishment that kept its doors open early for the miners coming off night shift. A few of them sat at the bar, nursing beers and coffee in equal measure, and Dale himself was wiping down glasses behind the counter. "Dante," he said, surprised, "you're usually in bed this time of day." "Couldn't sleep." I slid onto a stool and ordered coffee, not trusting myself with anything stronger. My hands were still shaking, and I shoved them into my pockets to hide it. "Dale, you hear anything strange lately? About the woods up my way?" Dale was 63 years old and had tended bar in this town since before I was born. He knew everyone, heard everything, and had a memory like a steel trap. If anyone had heard something, it would be him. "Strange how?" He poured my coffee and set it in front of me, his eyes sharp despite his casual tone. "Animals acting weird. Deer bunching up, dogs going crazy, that kind of thing." Dale was quiet for a moment, polishing a glass that was already clean. "Mabel was in here last week," he said finally, "talking about her chickens. Said they wouldn't come out of the coop, like something had put the fear of God into them." "Anything else?" "Bill Patterson found one of his goats torn up about 2 weeks back. Thought it was dogs at first, but the way it was torn..." Dale shook his head. "Never seen a dog do that kind of damage. The county sent someone out. Said it was probably a bear, but Bill's hunted these mountains 60 years, and he says it wasn't any bear he's ever seen sign of." I felt the cold coil tighter in my gut. "What did he think it was?" "Didn't say. Just said he's keeping his goats in the barn now, even though he never has before." Dale leaned on the counter, his voice dropping. "Why? You see something up there?" I opened my mouth to answer, to tell him about the eyes and the silence and the destroyed cameras, but the words wouldn't come. How could I explain it? How could I make him understand without sounding like I'd lost my mind? "Just wondering," I said. "Woods have been quiet lately." Dale studied me for a long moment, and I had the uncomfortable feeling that he saw more than I wanted him to. "My grandfather used to tell stories," he said finally, "about things in these hollers that didn't have names, things that were here before us and would be here after. He said the old-timers knew to stay inside on certain nights, to keep their fires burning and their doors locked. Said the mountains had a way of taking people who didn't show proper respect." "What kind of things?" Dale shrugged. He never said exactly. Just that some places were older than they looked, and some things that lived in them didn't follow the rules we thought we knew. He picked up another glass to polish. "Probably just stories. You know how the old folks were." I nodded, but I was thinking about those eyes, 8 feet off the ground, blinking once before they vanished into nothing. I was thinking about the silence that fell over the woods like a blanket, and the smell of copper and rot, and the way Boone pressed against my leg like he was trying to push us both through the floor to safety. Just stories. Right. I finished my coffee and drove back to the cabin, stopping at the hardware store on the way to buy more batteries for my cameras and a set of motion sensor lights for the porch. The guy at the register, a kid barely out of high school, asked if I was worried about break-ins. "Something like that," I said. That night I set up the new cameras, 4 of them arranged in a perimeter around the cabin, all of them pointed toward the tree line and the logging road. I installed the motion lights and tested them twice, watching them blaze into life when I walked through their range. I checked my rifle and loaded a spare magazine and put them both within easy reach of every door. And then I settled into the living room with Boone and waited for dark. The sun went down around 7, and the shadows started stretching across the yard, like fingers reaching for the cabin. I watched them through the gap in the curtains, my hands wrapped around a cup of coffee I didn't drink, and I felt that familiar dread settling into my bones like cold water. Nothing happened for hours. The motion lights stayed dark. The cameras showed only empty frames when I checked them on my phone. I'd splurged on wireless models this time, something I could monitor from inside. Boone lay at my feet, watchful but not growling, and I started to wonder if maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe the stress had gotten to me, like Earl thought. Maybe I needed to take a few days off, go stay with my brother in Charleston, get some perspective. Then at 11:23 p.m., the motion light on the south side of the cabin clicked on. I was on my feet instantly, rifle in hand, moving to the window that faced that direction. Boone was growling again, that low, terrible sound, and his hackles were up in a ridge that made him look like a different animal entirely. The light illuminated a cone of space extending about 30 feet from the cabin wall, washing everything in harsh white brightness. At the edge of that light, where the illumination faded into darkness, something stood against the trees. It wasn't the eyes this time. It was a shape, a silhouette, massive and wrong, hunched against the trunk of an old oak, like it was trying to hide. But there was no hiding something that big. The shoulders were too broad, impossibly broad, and the arms, if they were arms, hung too long, the ends of them nearly touching the ground even though the body was standing more or less upright. The head was harder to see, turned away from me, but it sat on a neck that was too thick, angled forward like a dog's. I couldn't see details. The light was too harsh, the contrast too strong, and the thing was just far enough away to be nothing but a black shape against the gray of the trees. But I could see the size of it. I could see the way it moved when it shifted its weight, the ripple of something under the darkness that suggested muscle and mass and terrible strength. 7 feet? 8? Hard to tell from this distance through a window, with my hands shaking so badly the rifle barrel was wavering, but big. Bigger than any bear I'd ever seen. Bigger than anything that should be walking around on 2 legs in these mountains. It turned its head toward the cabin. The light caught its eyes. Those same yellow-green points, reflecting back at me with that awful patient intelligence I'd seen before. The silhouette shifted, the arms moving, and for one horrible moment I thought it was going to step into the light, was going to come toward the cabin, was going to show me what it really looked like. I raised the rifle. I don't know if it saw the movement or sensed the intent, but it went still, absolutely still, like a deer that spotted a hunter and is deciding whether to run or freeze. The eyes stayed fixed on me, on the window, on the gap, in the curtains where I was watching. Boone's growl peaked into something almost like a scream, and I felt him pressing against my leg hard enough to bruise. The thing in the trees moved. Not toward me, sideways, into the darkness beyond the reach of the motion light. It moved wrong, I realized. The legs bent in places they shouldn't, and the arms swung in a way that made my brain hurt trying to process. It was fast, too. Faster than something that big should be able to move. One moment it was at the edge of the light, and the next moment it was gone, swallowed by the shadows between the trees. The motion light stayed on for another 30 seconds, illuminating nothing but empty forest, before clicking off. I stood at that window until my legs gave out, and then I sat on the floor with my back against the wall and my rifle across my knees, and I watched the darkness through the gap in the curtains. Boone curled up against my side, still trembling, and I put one hand on his head and kept the other on my gun. The cameras showed nothing when I checked them. No images, no motion alerts, nothing. Just empty frames of forest and shadows, like the thing had never been there at all. But I'd seen it. I'd seen the shape of it, the size of it, the wrongness of the way it moved. I'd seen those eyes looking at me with something that might have been hunger or curiosity or something I didn't have a word for. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a mountain lion or a sick dog or a meth head in a costume or any of the other explanations I'd been clinging to. It was something else entirely. Something that didn't fit into any category I knew. Something that belonged to the world my grandfather's stories hinted at. The world where the mountains were older than they looked, and the things that lived in them didn't follow the rules. I sat there until dawn, watching the shadows slowly lighten into gray, and I tried to convince myself that I hadn't seen what I knew I'd seen. It didn't work. The shape of that silhouette was burned into my memory, playing on a loop every time I closed my eyes. Those shoulders, those arms, that head turned toward me with patient, terrible intelligence. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't having a breakdown. Something was out there in my woods. Something that had been watching me for days. Something that moved through the darkness like it owned it. And I had no idea what it was or what it wanted. The sun came up and I pulled myself off the floor on legs that felt like rubber. Boone followed me to the kitchen, where I made coffee on autopilot and stood staring out the window at the tree line. In daylight, the woods looked normal again. Beautiful even, with the morning mist rising off the creek and the light catching the red and gold of the leaves. A pair of crows called to each other from somewhere up the ridge. A squirrel ran across the yard gathering acorns. Normal, peaceful. Like nothing had happened at all. I thought about calling someone. Earl, maybe, or my brother in Charleston. I thought about loading Boone into the truck and driving away, leaving the cabin and the hollow and whatever was watching me from the trees. I thought about a lot of things while I stood there drinking my coffee and watching the morning light spread across the yard, but I didn't do any of them, because part of me, a stupid, stubborn part that I probably inherited from my grandfather, along with the cabin and the hollow and the blood-deep connection to these mountains, part of me wanted to know, wanted to understand what I was dealing with, wanted to see it clearly in the light and know for certain what kind of thing had invaded my world. That part of me won out over the fear, at least for the moment. I spent the day fortifying the cabin. I nailed boards over the windows that faced the tree line, leaving just enough gap to see through. I dragged the heavy oak dresser from the back bedroom and pushed it against the back door. I checked my ammunition supply, plenty of .30-06 rounds, plus a box of buckshot for the shotgun I kept in the closet, and loaded everything I could. I filled every pot and container in the kitchen with water, because some part of my brain had decided that a siege might be coming. Boone watched me work, his tail low, his eyes tracking every movement I made. He knew something was wrong. He'd known it before I did. From that first evening when the silence fell and he'd growled at something I couldn't see. He was scared. I could see it in the white around his eyes, hear it in the whimpers he made when I walked too close to a window. But he wasn't running. He was staying with me, loyal, brave, better than any human I knew. I finished my preparations around 4 in the afternoon, with maybe 3 hours of daylight left. The cabin looked like a fortress, or at least like the home of someone who'd lost his grip on reality. I stood in the middle of the living room and looked at the boarded windows, the barricaded door, the rifles propped against every wall, and I laughed. A short, ugly sound that made Boone's ears flatten against his head. "It's okay, boy," I told him. "We're going to be okay." I didn't believe it, not really. But I said it anyway because sometimes you have to say things out loud to make them feel possible. The sun went down. I positioned myself in the corner of the living room that gave me the best view of both the front door and the gaps in the boarded windows. Boone curled up at my feet, pressed against my legs, and I could feel him trembling. The motion lights clicked on and off as the wind moved branches through their range, and every time they lit up, I jerked my rifle toward the window, expecting to see that massive silhouette standing at the edge of the light. Hours passed. Nothing happened. I started to relax, just a little. Maybe it wasn't coming tonight. Maybe it had moved on, found easier prey, decided I wasn't worth the trouble. Maybe the lights all went out at once, not the motion lights. Those were still working, clicking on and off with the wind. But the lights inside the cabin, the ones I'd left blazing in every room, all of them died in the same instant. The darkness crashed in like a wave, total and absolute. And for a long, horrible moment, I couldn't see anything at all. Boone's growl started before my eyes adjusted. That low, terrible sound that I'd learned to dread, coming from somewhere near my feet, directed at something I couldn't see. I fumbled for the flashlight I'd set beside me, found it, clicked it on. The beam caught the window, and through the gap in the boards, through that narrow strip of glass I'd left unobstructed, I saw the thing. It was pressed against the window from outside, so close that its breath was fogging the glass. The snout was longer than I'd expected, longer than a wolf's, filled with teeth that gleamed in my flashlight's beam. The fur was gray-brown and matted, patchy in places, clumped together with something dark that might have been blood. But the eyes were what I couldn't look away from. Yellow-green reflecting my light back at me, filled with an intelligence that made my stomach turn. It wasn't the blank stare of a predator looking at prey. It was aware, curious, amused maybe, like it was enjoying my terror, savoring it. The face pressed closer to the glass, and I saw the lips peel back from those teeth in something that might have been a smile. Then the window shattered. Boone lunged before I could react, 70 pounds of German Shepherd fury launching himself at the arm that came through the broken glass. An arm, not a leg, not a paw, but an arm with a hand at the end of it. A hand with fingers and black claws that hooked toward my face. Boone's teeth closed on that arm and he pulled, dragging, snarling, and the thing outside screamed. Not howled, screamed. A sound that was almost human, almost word-shaped, that made my ears ring and my vision blur with pain. I raised the rifle and fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space, and the muzzle flash painted everything in strobe light images. Boone's teeth sunk into gray-furred flesh, black blood spraying across the floor, the arm jerking back through the window, taking boards with it. I worked the bolt and fired again, aiming at the shadow beyond the glass, and then again, and again, until the rifle clicked empty and my ears were ringing so badly I couldn't hear anything at all. Silence. The motion lights outside clicked on, illuminating nothing but broken glass and splintered boards. Boone was still barking. I could see his mouth moving, his body shaking with the force of it, but I couldn't hear him through the ringing in my ears. Blood was dripping from his muzzle, and I couldn't tell if it was his or the thing's. I reloaded the rifle with hands that shook so badly I dropped 2 rounds on the floor. Then I grabbed the flashlight and swept the beam through the broken window, searching the yard for movement. Nothing. The thing was gone. Boone limped over to me and pressed himself against my leg, and I saw the gashes then. 3 deep gouges across his ribs, seeping blood that matted his fur and dripped onto my boots. The thing had gotten him while he was saving my life. "Good boy," I said, or maybe just mouthed it. I still couldn't hear anything but the ringing. "Good boy, Boone. You're okay. You're going to be okay." I didn't know if that was true, but I said it anyway because what else could I do? The motion lights clicked off, and the darkness rushed back in. I stood in my shattered cabin with my bleeding dog and my empty rifle, and I waited for the thing to come back. It didn't. The night stretched on, hour after hour of darkness and silence, broken only by the occasional click of the motion lights responding to wind or animals or nothing at all. I wrapped Boone's wounds with torn strips of bedsheet and held pressure on the deepest one until the bleeding slowed. I reloaded every weapon I owned and positioned myself in the corner farthest from the broken window, watching the gap where the thing had reached through. By the time the first gray light of dawn crept over the ridge, I knew 2 things with absolute certainty. First, it was real. Not a hallucination, not a breakdown, not a sick bear or a crazy person in a costume. I had its blood on my floor. I had its claw marks on my dog. It was real, and it had tried to get into my cabin, and only Boone's desperate courage had stopped it. Second, I couldn't stay here. Whatever that thing was, whatever it wanted, I was no match for it alone. The rifles I'd trusted my whole life hadn't stopped it. I'd hit it at least twice, I was sure of that. But it had still been strong enough to pull back through the window and disappear into the woods. Next time it might not be surprised. Next time Boone might not be fast enough. I carried Boone to the truck as soon as the light was strong enough to see. He whimpered when I lifted him, but didn't struggle, just pressed his head against my chest and looked at me with those trusting brown eyes. I put him in the passenger seat and drove down the logging road as fast as the ruts would allow, and I didn't look back at the cabin shrinking in my rear-view mirror. The emergency vet in Beckley was 40 miles away, and I made it in 30 minutes, taking curves too fast and running 1 red light because I couldn't make myself stop. The woman at the front desk took 1 look at Boone's wounds and rushed us into an exam room. And when the vet came in, a tired-looking man in his 50s with kind eyes, he asked what had happened. "Bear," I said, "a big one. Came through the window." He looked at me for a long moment at the blood on my clothes and the shaking in my hands and the wild look I'm sure was in my eyes, and he nodded slowly. "We'll take care of him," he said. "The cuts are deep but clean. He'll need stitches and antibiotics, but I think he'll be okay." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "You should probably have someone look at you too. You're bleeding." I looked down at my hands and realized he was right. I'd cut them on the broken glass without noticing, probably when I was trying to see through the window. The blood was crusted now, dried into the creases of my palms. "I'm fine," I said. "Just take care of Boone." The vet worked on Boone for 2 hours while I sat in the waiting room, watching the door and flinching at every sound. The receptionist brought me coffee I didn't drink and gave me worried looks. I pretended not to notice. When the vet finally came out to tell me Boone was going to be okay, I thanked him and paid the bill and carried my dog, groggy from anesthesia, bandaged and stitched and alive, back out to the truck. I sat in the parking lot for a long time after that, with Boone sleeping on the seat beside me, and I watched the sun climb higher into the sky. The world looked normal out here. Cars passing on the highway, people going about their business, life continuing like it always had. None of them knew what was in the woods 40 miles away. None of them would believe me if I told them. I thought about driving to the sheriff's office, filing a report, telling someone official what had happened. But what would I say? A werewolf attacked my cabin? The deputies would think I'd lost my mind. And maybe they'd be right. And either way, it wouldn't help. The thing was out there in the woods, in my hollow, and nothing in the sheriff's office could stop it. I thought about calling my brother, asking if I could stay with him in Charleston for a while. But that felt like running, like admitting defeat. And even after everything that had happened, some stubborn part of me refused to give up the land my grandfather had loved, the cabin my father was born in. In the end, I just sat there watching the sun and trying to figure out what to do next. Boone woke up around noon, his tail thumping weakly against the seat when he saw me. I scratched behind his ears and told him what a good boy he was, how brave he'd been, how he'd saved my life. He licked my hand once, weakly, and then closed his eyes again. The vet had said he'd be groggy for the rest of the day, that I should keep him quiet and make sure he didn't tear his stitches. I drove to a diner on the edge of Beckley, one of those places that serves breakfast all day, and I sat in a booth by the window where I could see the parking lot and the truck and Boone sleeping in the passenger seat. The waitress brought me eggs and toast and more coffee, and I ate without tasting any of it, my mind running in circles that always ended up in the same place. What the hell was I going to do now? I couldn't go back to the cabin, not yet, maybe not ever. The thing had been inside my home, had stood in my kitchen, had looked at me with those intelligent yellow eyes like it was deciding whether to kill me or let me live. The bullets had hurt it, I'd seen that, heard that scream. But they hadn't stopped it. It had crashed through my window and disappeared into the dark, and for all I knew, it was still out there, healing, waiting, planning. But I couldn't just abandon everything either. My whole life was in that hollow. My job at the mine, my equipment, my grandfather's rifles, the photo albums my mother had given me after Dad died. All of it sitting in a cabin with a broken window and blood on the floor, and no one to protect it but the ghosts of the people who'd lived there before me. I finished my breakfast and paid the check and drove to a hardware store on the other side of town. I bought plywood and nails, a new deadbolt lock, and enough ammunition to start a small war. The clerk looked at me funny when I piled it all on the counter. Blood-stained clothes, wild eyes, 300 rounds of .30-06. But he didn't say anything. Maybe he thought I was a prepper, one of those guys who lived in the hills and waited for the government to collapse. Let him think that. It was better than the truth. I drove back toward the hollow in the early afternoon when the sun was high and bright, and I could almost convince myself that everything would be okay. Boone was more alert now, lifting his head to look out the window, though he whined when we turned onto the logging road. I reached over and rested my hand on his neck, feeling the bandages under my palm, and I told him we'd be quick. In and out. Just long enough to board up the window and grab some clothes and get the hell out. The cabin looked worse in daylight. The kitchen window was a gaping hole, shards of glass glittering on the porch and in the weeds below. The door hung crooked on its hinges where the thing had forced its way through. I could see the splintered wood from 50 feet away, the raw wounds in the timber that had stood solid for 80 years. I left Boone in the truck with the windows cracked and the doors locked. He didn't want me to go. He barked and scratched at the window and gave me a look of pure betrayal. But I couldn't risk him tearing his stitches, and I couldn't bring myself to take him back inside that place. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The smell hit me as soon as I stepped onto the porch. Musk and copper and something rotten underneath. The same smell that had warned me 3 nights ago when Boone's hackles had first risen on the logging road. It was stronger now, concentrated, like the thing had marked my cabin as its territory. I breathed through my mouth and tried not to think about what that meant. Inside, the damage was worse than I'd feared. The creature hadn't just come in and gone out. It had lingered, explored, touched everything. My couch cushions were slashed, stuffing spilling out like entrails. The kitchen table was overturned. One leg snapped clean off. My grandfather's rifles were still on the wall, thank God. But the glass case that protected them was shattered, and when I looked closer, I could see scratches in the stock of the old Winchester, like something had run its claws along the wood. And there were prints everywhere. On the floor, on the walls, on the counter where I'd made my coffee just 2 mornings ago. Not paw prints, handprints, or something close to it, with 4 long fingers and a thumb that was almost human and claws that had gouged deep furrows in the linoleum. I stood there staring at them for a long time, my breakfast turning to acid in my stomach, because those prints told me something I hadn't wanted to believe. It had been looking at things, picking things up, examining them. The book I'd been reading was on the floor, pages scattered, and when I picked it up, I could see where claws had pierced the cover, 4 neat holes punched through paper and cardboard. The photo on my bedside table, me and Laura on our wedding day, the only picture of her I'd kept, was face down, the glass cracked, and there was a smear of something dark and wet across Laura's smile that I didn't want to think about. I boarded up the window as fast as I could, driving nails with shaking hands, flinching at every sound from the woods. I grabbed clothes and ammunition and the photo albums and anything else I could fit in a duffel bag, and I got the hell out of there before the shadows started to lengthen. Boone was still barking when I climbed back into the truck, but his tail wagged when he saw me, and he pressed himself against my side as I drove down the logging road, away from the cabin, away from everything I'd built my life around. I spent that night in a motel on the highway, one of those places that charges by the week and doesn't ask questions about the German Shepherd on the bed or the rifle propped against the nightstand. I lay awake until dawn, listening to the trucks rumble past on the highway, and I tried to make sense of what was happening to me. The rational part of my brain kept insisting there had to be an explanation. A bear with mange, maybe. One that had learned to open doors and stand on its hind legs. A hoax. Someone in a costume. Teenagers playing a sick joke that had gotten out of hand. Some kind of escaped animal from a private zoo. A hybrid or a mutant that the owner was too afraid to report. But I'd seen it. I'd looked into those eyes, and I'd seen something looking back. Something intelligent. Something that had studied my home, my belongings, my life, like it was learning who I was before it decided what to do with me. I called in sick to work for the next 3 days. Earl from the mine called to check on me, asked if everything was okay, and I told him I'd had a break-in at the cabin and was dealing with the aftermath. He offered to help, to come out with his truck and his guns and help me chase off whoever was messing with me, and I thanked him and said I had it handled. What else could I say? That a 7-foot wolf man had broken into my kitchen and looked at my wedding photos? On the 4th day, I went back to work. I couldn't afford not to. The mine didn't pay if you didn't show up, and I had bills and vet bills and a motel room eating through my savings. The night shift felt different now, though. The tunnels had always been dark, always been full of sounds that echoed in ways that made you imagine things that weren't there. But now every shadow seemed to have weight. Every unexplained noise made my heart lurch in my chest. The other miners noticed. They asked if I was sick, if something was wrong, if I needed to talk to someone. I told them I was fine, just tired, just dealing with some personal stuff, and they nodded and left me alone. That's what people did in the Hollow. They respected your privacy, even when they knew you were lying. I went back to the cabin on my days off, always in daylight, always with Boone in the truck and a rifle in my hands. The first time I half expected to find it waiting for me, crouched in the kitchen or perched on the roof, like some gargoyle from a nightmare. But the cabin was empty, the plywood still nailed over the window, the door still barricaded with the chair I'd wedged under the handle. Boone's stitches came out after 2 weeks. The vet said he was healing well, that the scars would fade eventually, that he was a tough dog and a lucky one. I didn't tell the vet that the scars ran 3 inches deep, that whatever had made them had claws like kitchen knives, that my dog had thrown himself at a monster to save my life. I just thanked him and paid the bill and took Boone home to the motel room that was starting to feel less temporary with every passing day. 3 weeks after the attack, I finally worked up the courage to spend a night at the cabin. I don't know why I did it. Stubbornness, maybe. Pride. The same bone-deep refusal to run that had kept my family in these hills for 5 generations, while everyone else moved to the cities and forgot where they came from. Or maybe I just needed to know if it was really over, if the bullets had done their job and driven the thing away for good. I arrived at dusk with Boone and a cooler full of food and enough ammunition to fight a small war. I checked every window, every door, every shadow, in every corner of every room. I lit a fire in the wood stove and made myself dinner and sat in my grandfather's chair with my rifle across my lap and my dog at my feet. And I waited. The first hour passed without incident. The second hour the same. By midnight, I was starting to think that maybe, just maybe, it was over, that the thing had decided I wasn't worth the trouble, or that the bullets had hurt it worse than I'd thought, or that it had moved on to easier prey. Boone's growl started around 1 a.m. It was the same growl I'd heard that first night on the logging road, low and rumbling and building from somewhere deep in his chest. He was staring at the window. Not the one I'd boarded up, but the one facing the porch, the one with the old curtains my grandmother had sewn 50 years ago, and his hackles were rising in a ridge along his spine. I raised the rifle and thumbed off the safety and waited, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth. For a long moment, nothing happened. Just Boone's growl and the crackle of the fire and the thud of my own pulse in my ears. Then, slowly, the curtain moved. Not from wind. The window was closed, sealed tight against the October chill. The fabric shifted like something had brushed against the glass from outside, a slight billowing that shouldn't have been possible, and Boone's growl rose to something close to a snarl. I crossed the room in 3 quick strides and yanked the curtain aside. Nothing. Just the porch, empty and dark, and the yard beyond it, and the tree line where the forest started its march up the ridge. I pressed my face to the glass and looked left, looked right, looked everywhere I could see, and there was nothing there. But there were marks on the glass. 4 long streaks running from the top of the window to the bottom, like something had dragged its fingers, its claws, down the pane. And at the bottom, pressed against the wood of the sill, there was a print, a handprint. I stood there staring at it for a long time, at those 4 long fingers and that almost human thumb, and those deep gouges where claws had scored the paint. The print was fresh. I could see moisture condensing around it, the warmth of whatever had made it fogging the cold glass. It had been standing right there, on my porch, looking in at me while I sat in my grandfather's chair and told myself I was safe. I backed away from the window and grabbed Boone's collar and retreated to the corner of the room farthest from any door or window. I sat there with my back against the wall and my rifle pointed at the darkness and my dog pressed against my leg, and I waited for dawn. It didn't come inside. Not that night. But I heard things. Out there in the dark. Footsteps on the porch. Slow and deliberate. Circling the cabin like a shark circling a boat. The creak of the boards under something heavy. Once a sound that might have been breathing, low and rhythmic, right outside the boarded window where it had crashed through 3 weeks before. And once, just once, I heard it speak. Not words, not anything human, a sound that was half growl, half something else, a vocalization that rose and fell in patterns that almost made sense, like it was trying to communicate, or mimicking something it had heard. I don't know how long it lasted, seconds maybe, or minutes that felt like hours. But when it stopped, the silence was worse than the sound had been. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in that corner with my gun and my dog, and I watched the windows until the sky started to lighten, and then I watched them some more. The thing didn't show itself again, didn't try to break in, didn't do anything but circle and breathe and make those sounds that I still hear sometimes when I'm trying to fall asleep. When the sun finally crested the ridge, I loaded Boone into the truck and drove away and didn't look back. And I knew with a certainty that settled into my bones like cold water that I couldn't stay here anymore. Not in the cabin, not in the hollow, maybe not anywhere in these mountains that the thing had claimed as its own. I started making plans that morning sitting in a diner in Beckley with my 3rd cup of coffee and a map spread out on the table in front of me. There were other mines, other jobs, other places I could go where the forest wasn't so close and the nights weren't so dark. Virginia had positions open, Kentucky too, places with towns and street lights and neighbors close enough to hear me if I screamed. But I couldn't just leave. Not yet. There were things I needed to do first. Sell the cabin, pack up what was left of my life, say goodbye to the land that had been my family's for 5 generations. And part of me, the stubborn part that wouldn't let go, kept thinking, maybe I could find another explanation. Maybe I could figure out what it was and how to stop it and take back what was mine. I started asking questions, carefully at first, because I didn't want people to think I'd lost my mind. I mentioned the strange behavior of the deer, the silence in the woods at night, the feeling of being watched. I asked Earl about the history of the hollow, about old stories his grandmother might have told him, about anything strange that had happened in these mountains before I was born. Earl laughed and told me the hollow had always been touched, that there were places in these hills where people didn't go after dark and nobody asked why. He told me about hunters who disappeared over the years, about hikers found torn apart and blamed on bears, about one old-timer who'd walked out of the forest in 1962 with his hair turned white and never spoke again. Just stories, he said. But the way he said it made me think he didn't believe that. Not really. Not all the way. I drove out to Mabel's place one afternoon. The neighbor who'd told me about her chickens hiding in the coop. She was 73 years old and sharp as a tack, and she'd lived in this hollow longer than anyone else alive. I brought her a jar of honey from the farmer's market and sat on her porch while she rocked in her chair and looked out at the tree line with eyes that had seen more than mine ever would. "You've seen it," she said before I could ask her anything. It wasn't a question. I nodded. My Henry saw it back in '67. Came running into the house, white as a sheet, and wouldn't go out after dark for the rest of his life. She was quiet for a moment, rocking slowly. We don't talk about it, never have. But it's been here longer than any of us. Longer than the mine, longer than the town, probably longer than the trees. "What is it?" I asked. She looked at me then, and there was something in her eyes. Not fear exactly, but respect. The kind of respect you give to a thunderstorm or a flash flood, something that can kill you without even meaning to. "Don't know," she said. "Don't think anyone does. But I know you can't kill it. Henry tried back then. Shot it twice with his daddy's shotgun. It just looked at him and walked away like the bullets were nothing. I thought about the 2 rounds I'd put into its chest, about the scream it had made, about the way it had crashed through my window and disappeared into the dark. Maybe I hadn't hurt it as badly as I'd thought. Maybe I just made it angry. "What do I do?" I asked. Mabel was quiet for a long time, rocking and watching the trees. "Leave," she said finally. That's what Henry wanted to do. We almost did it too. Had the house packed up and the truck loaded and everything, but then it stopped coming around and we told ourselves it was over and we stayed. She paused, her eyes distant. "I don't know if it forgets you or just moves on to something else. But I know it remembers. Eventually, it always remembers." I thanked her and drove back to the motel with her words echoing in my head. It always remembers. That night, I went back to the cabin to get the last of my things. It was foolish, I know. I should have gone in daylight, should have brought someone with me, should have had more sense than to walk back into the jaws of the trap that had already closed around me once. But I needed my grandfather's rifles, the ones still hanging on the wall, the last pieces of him I'd left. I couldn't leave them behind. I arrived at dusk, which was my first mistake. The second was leaving Boone in the truck while I went inside. But his wounds were barely healed, and I couldn't bear the thought of bringing him back into that place. He barked and scratched at the window as I walked toward the cabin, and I told him I'd be quick. Just in and out. 5 minutes, maybe less. The cabin smelled wrong. Not like before, not that overwhelming musk and copper and rot, but wrong in a different way, like something fundamental about the space had changed. The air was heavier. The shadows were darker. And when I crossed the threshold, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up like I was being watched. I moved fast, grabbing the rifles from the wall, stuffing them into the cases I'd brought. My grandfather's Winchester, his old Remington, the shotgun my father had used to teach me to shoot. I was almost to the door when I heard it. A sound from the bedroom. Soft, like something shifting weight, like something settling into a more comfortable position. I stopped moving, stopped breathing. The rifle was in my hands, but not loaded. I'd been in such a hurry I hadn't taken the time. And I stood there in the growing darkness and listened to whatever was in my bedroom listen back. Then I heard it sniff, a long, wet inhale, like it was tasting my scent on the air. I ran. I hit the porch at full speed and nearly fell down the stairs, the rifle cases banging against my legs as I sprinted for the truck. Behind me, I heard the crash of something big moving fast, heard the splintering of wood and the thud of something heavy hitting the floor, and I didn't look back. I just ran. Boone was going crazy in the truck, barking and snarling and throwing himself against the window. I yanked the door open and dove inside and fumbled the keys into the ignition as something dark and massive emerged from my cabin door. It didn't chase me down the driveway. It just stood there on the porch, silhouetted against the light from inside, and it watched me go. I could see the yellow gleam of its eyes in my rear-view mirror, reflecting my taillights, growing smaller as I put distance between us, but never looking away. It had been in my cabin, in my bedroom, waiting, not hunting, not attacking, waiting. That was when I understood. It knew who I was. It knew where I lived, where I worked, where I went, and when I went there. It had studied me the way I might study a deer I was tracking, learning my patterns, my habits, the rhythms of my life. I wasn't the hunter here. I never had been. I was the prey. I drove straight to the mine that night, to the one place I could think of where there were people around, lights on, life and movement, and the comforting clatter of machinery running 24 hours a day. I sat in the parking lot until my shift started, and then I went underground, into the darkness of the tunnels that had always made me uneasy. And for the first time in my life, I felt safe down there. Nothing could follow me into the mine. The tunnels were narrow and well lit and full of men who would notice if something that shouldn't be there came walking out of the darkness. For 8 hours, I could breathe. For 8 hours, I could pretend that the world above was normal. But I had to come back up eventually. I had to go back to the motel room that suddenly felt as flimsy as cardboard, to the parking lot that bordered a patch of woods, to a world where the thing was out there somewhere, waiting and watching and remembering. I started making preparations. I moved from the motel near the highway to one in the middle of town, where there were streetlights and passing cars and people who might hear me if I called for help. I stopped going anywhere alone after dark. I kept a rifle in my truck, a pistol in my belt, a knife in my boot. I slept in 2-hour shifts, if I slept at all, and I kept Boone on the bed beside me with the door locked and a chair wedged under the handle. It didn't matter. 3 nights after I fled the cabin, I woke up to Boone's growl and found footprints in the parking lot outside my window. The same prints I'd seen at the cabin. 4 fingers, 1 thumb, claws that gouged the asphalt like it was soft clay. They circled my truck, approached my door, and then retreated into the shadows between the streetlights. It had followed me through town, past all the lights and people and traffic. It had found me and marked my door like a wolf, marking its territory. I stopped sleeping after that. Caffeine and fear kept me awake, and when my body finally shut down against my will, I slept in the bathtub with the door locked, and Boone pressed against the porcelain, because at least there I might have a few seconds warning before it broke through. I tried to tell someone just once. I called my brother, the one in Charleston, and I told him I needed help. I told him something was wrong, that I was in trouble, that I didn't know what to do. He drove up the next day, took one look at my hollow eyes and shaking hands, and told me I needed to see a doctor, that I was having a breakdown, that the divorce had finally caught up with me and I was losing my grip on reality. I almost showed him the prints in the parking lot, but when I went to look for them, they were gone, washed away by the rain that had fallen overnight, or worn down by the traffic that passed through, or maybe, and this thought chilled me more than anything, erased by something that didn't want to be found. My brother took me to dinner and told me about therapists and medications and the importance of talking to someone professional. He said he was worried about me. He said Mom was worried about me. He said everyone was worried about me. And wouldn't I please just come to Charleston for a while, get away from this place that had always been a little too isolated, a little too wild? I told him I was fine, that I just needed some time, that I'd figure things out on my own. He left the next morning with a promise to call every day and check on me. He kept that promise for about a week before the calls became every other day, then twice a week, then once a week at most. I didn't blame him. He had his own life, his own problems, and I was just his little brother who'd always been a bit strange, a bit too attached to the old ways and the old places. I was alone, and the thing was getting closer. I found claw marks on my truck one morning, 4 long scratches down the driver's side door that hadn't been there the night before. I found fur caught in the chain link fence at the edge of the parking lot, coarse and gray-brown, the same color I remembered from the headlights of my truck. I found a dead rabbit on my doorstep, torn nearly in half, its blood still warm when I stepped out to go to work. A gift, an offering, a message. I don't know what it was trying to tell me. Maybe it was claiming me, marking me as its territory the way wolves mark their kills. Maybe it was playing with me, the way a cat plays with a mouse before the final strike. Or maybe, and this thought haunted me more than the others, it was communicating, trying to establish some kind of relationship that I couldn't understand. Whatever it was, I couldn't take it anymore. I put in my transfer request on a Friday morning, asking for any position in southwestern Virginia, anywhere that wasn't here. The HR woman looked at me funny. I was a good worker, experienced, the kind of miner they didn't want to lose. But she processed the paperwork without asking too many questions. Maybe she'd heard things too. Maybe everyone in this hollow had heard things, and we'd all agreed not to talk about them. I put the cabin up for sale that afternoon. Took a loss on it, just like I'd known I would. Nobody wanted property that deep in the woods anymore. Especially not after everything that had happened. But a man from the city bought it sight unseen for cash, said he wanted a hunting retreat, and I didn't warn him about what lived in those woods. Maybe I should have. Maybe it would have made a difference. But I was so desperate to get out that I would have sold that place to the devil himself if he'd shown me the money. I had 2 weeks before my transfer went through. 2 weeks before I could leave the hollow and the cabin and the mountains that had been my home for 34 years. 2 weeks to survive, and I didn't know if I would make it. The thing was closing in. I could feel it in the way Boone growled at every shadow, in the way the other miners looked at me like they could see something marked on my skin, in the dreams that came when I finally collapsed from exhaustion and slept too deep to wake at every sound. In the dreams, it was always standing at the edge of the tree line, watching me with those yellow eyes. And in the dreams, I always walked toward it like something was pulling me, calling me, welcoming me home to a place I'd never been. I had 2 weeks, and somewhere out there, in the darkness between the streetlights, the thing that had claimed me was waiting to see what I would do next. The full moon came on a Thursday night. I'd been counting the days, though I told myself it was coincidence, that whatever stalked me wasn't bound by the old legends, the werewolf myths I'd grown up hearing around campfires and dismissed as stories to scare children. But some part of me, the same part that had known those eyes were wrong, that had felt the wrongness in the silence before I ever saw anything, knew that the moon mattered, that something about that pale light called to whatever hunted in the dark. I was staying in the motel room I'd rented after selling the cabin, a shabby place off Route 19 with thin walls and a parking lot that smelled like diesel and desperation. Boone was curled at the foot of the bed, his scars still pink and tender, wounds that had never quite healed right since the cabin attack weeks ago, the attack I'd told everyone was a bear, the wounds that didn't match any bear's paw print in any wildlife book I'd ever seen. He'd been healing slowly, sleeping more than usual, and some nights I'd catch him whimpering in his dreams, legs twitching like he was running from something he couldn't escape. I couldn't sleep. The moon hung fat and white outside my window, painting everything in that cold light that made shadows seem darker by contrast. I'd checked the locks 3 times already. The rifle leaned against the nightstand within arm's reach, loaded, safety off. I knew it wouldn't be enough. I'd seen what 2 shots to the chest had done, which was not nearly enough to kill it, but it was better than nothing. Better than waiting in the dark with empty hands. Around midnight, Boone's head came up. He didn't growl at first. He just stared at the door, ears pricked forward, every muscle in his body going rigid, with a tension I recognized. I'd seen it before on the logging road in the cabin every time the thing had gotten close enough to smell. My hand found the rifle grip before my conscious mind had processed what was happening. Then the smell hit me. It seeped under the door like poison gas. That wrong musk of wet fur and copper and rot. And my stomach lurched with a fear so primal it bypassed every rational thought I'd ever had. This was the fear of the prey animal, the mouse frozen before the striking snake, the deer paralyzed in the headlights. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to run to. The thing was outside my door, and the window led to a parking lot 50 feet from the tree line, and I knew with absolute certainty that it could run faster than I ever would. Boone started growling then, low and deep, the sound building in his chest like an engine revving. He moved off the bed despite his injuries, placing himself between me and the door, his lips pulling back from his teeth in a snarl that would have terrified me if I hadn't been so grateful for his courage. The door handle rattled. Read, not a knock, not a scratch. The handle itself moved, twisted, as if something was testing it, learning how it worked. I watched the deadbolt with my heart hammering against my ribs, praying that cheap motel lock would hold, knowing it wouldn't be enough if the thing decided to come through. The rattling stopped. For a long moment, nothing happened. The smell hung thick in the air, and I could hear something outside. Breathing, slow and deep. The sound of lungs that had no business being that large. Boone's growl never wavered, but I could see the tremor in his legs, the way his wounded side hitched with each breath. He was terrified just like me, but he wouldn't leave. Then the window exploded inward. Glass sprayed across the room like shrapnel, and something huge came through the frame in a shower of curtains and splintered wood. I had a frozen instant to see it, really see it, before instinct took over and I fired. 7 feet of nightmare at least, maybe more. The ceiling was only 8 feet high, and it had to hunch to fit. Shoulders broader than any man's, arms that hung nearly to its knees and ended in hands. God help me, they were hands, with fingers and joints and knuckles, but tipped with claws like black curved knives. The fur was patchy, matted in places with something dark encrusted, gray-brown in the moonlight except where it caught the lamp, and showed russet undertones, like dried blood. The head was wrong in ways I still see when I close my eyes. Lupine? Yes. With a snout full of teeth that gleamed wet and yellow. But the skull was too large, the brow too pronounced, sheltering eyes that glowed with an intelligence no animal should possess. It moved like something that had learned to be bipedal but remembered being something else. Shoulders rolling, weight shifting in a way that suggested it could drop to all fours in an instant if it wanted to. The worst part was the way it looked at me, not with hunger, not with rage, but with something like recognition, like it had been waiting for this moment, planning it, savoring the anticipation, like we had an appointment and I was right on time. I fired twice before I could think. The rifle kicked against my shoulder, deafening in the small room, and I saw the bullets hit. One in the chest, one lower near the ribs, and the thing staggered back a step, a sound ripping from its throat that was neither howl nor scream, but something between, something that vibrated in my chest and made my vision blur at the edges. Blood sprayed, dark and thick, and for one wild instant I thought I'd killed it, that the nightmare was over. Then it straightened up and smiled at me. I don't know how else to describe it. The lips pulled back, the jaw opened wider than should have been possible, and there was something in the expression that was almost amused. Like I'd done exactly what it expected, and now it was time for the real game to begin. It lunged. I didn't have time to fire again. The rifle was knocked from my hands as I threw myself sideways, crashing into the nightstand and sending the lamp shattering to the floor. The room plunged into darkness lit only by the moon through the broken window, and I felt claws rake across my back, tearing through my shirt and the skin beneath, pain exploding along my spine like liquid fire. I screamed. I'm not ashamed to admit it, and scrambled toward the bathroom. Some animal part of my brain thinking small space, can't fit, might survive. Boone saved me. He launched himself at the thing's throat with every ounce of strength his injured body could muster, 70 pounds of German Shepherd fury hitting it from the side while it was focused on me. The thing reeled, one massive arm sweeping around to bat him away, but Boone had his jaws locked on something. The neck, the shoulder, I couldn't see. And he wouldn't let go. They crashed into the wall together, sheetrock crumbling, and I heard Boone yelp as claws found his side again, reopening the wounds that had barely begun to heal. 3 seconds. Maybe 4. That's all he bought me. But it was enough. I grabbed the rifle from where it had fallen, pivoted and put 3 rounds into the thing's back at point-blank range while it was trying to pry Boone from its throat. Each shot punched through like hitting wet meat, and this time the scream that came out of it was different. Higher, more desperate, edged with something that might have been pain. It threw Boone across the room, and I heard my dog hit the wall with a sound that stopped my heart, but I was already firing again, emptying the magazine into the thing's chest and head as it turned toward me. It didn't fall, but it stopped coming. We stared at each other across the wrecked motel room, both of us bleeding, both of us breathing hard. Its eyes still glowed in the darkness, but something had changed in them. The amusement was gone, replaced by something harder to read. Respect, maybe, or calculation. It was deciding whether I was worth the trouble. Then, without a sound, it turned and went back through the window. I watched it go. Watched that massive shape drop into the parking lot and lope toward the tree line on legs that bent wrong, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for something so badly wounded. It hit the trees and vanished, swallowed by the darkness like it had never been there at all. I stood there with the empty rifle in my hands, blood running down my back, glass crunching under my boots, and I didn't move for what felt like hours. Boone whimpered. The sound broke whatever spell had frozen me, and I was across the room in an instant, dropping to my knees beside my dog, my hands finding his fur in the darkness. He was bleeding again, the scars on his side torn open, and when I touched his ribs, I felt the wrongness of bones that had shifted, the wet heat of blood soaking through his coat. But his tail thumped weakly against the carpet when he heard my voice, and his tongue found my hand, and he was alive. He was alive, and so was I. I wrapped him in the motel bedspread as carefully as I could, ignoring the fire in my own back, the blood soaking through my shirt, the trembling in my hands that wouldn't stop no matter how hard I tried. I grabbed my keys and my wallet and left everything else, the rifle, my clothes, everything I'd brought with me, and carried my dog out to the truck. The parking lot was empty. The moon hung overhead, like an accusation, like a witness. And somewhere in the trees, I could hear something moving, watching, waiting to see what I would do next. I drove. The emergency vet in Beckley was 40 miles away, and I made it in 25 minutes, running every red light, taking curves at speeds that should have killed us both. Boone lay on the passenger seat with his head in my lap, and I kept one hand on his chest the whole way, feeling his heartbeat, making sure it kept going. The blood from my back had soaked through the seat by the time I pulled into the parking lot, and when I carried him inside, the vet tech took one look at us and started shouting for the doctor. They asked me what happened. Bear attack, I said. Same thing I'd said before. Same lie that felt more ridiculous every time it left my mouth. They didn't believe me. I could see it in their eyes, in the way they looked at my wounds, and then at Boone's, at the pattern of the cuts that didn't match any bear's paw print in any wildlife guide. But they didn't argue. They took Boone into the back and told me to sit down. And when I refused, a nurse put her hand on my shoulder and said very quietly that I needed medical attention too. I let them clean my wounds. 4 deep gouges across my back, from my right shoulder blade to my left hip, each one requiring stitches. The doctor asked if I'd gotten a good look at the bear, how big it was, whether I'd reported it to Fish and Wildlife. I told him it was dark, that everything happened fast, that I just wanted to make sure my dog was okay. He nodded like he understood, but his eyes said he knew I was lying. I sat in the waiting room until dawn, my back on fire, my hands still shaking, watching the windows and waiting for something to come crashing through. It never did. When the sun crested the hills and painted the parking lot in gold, I felt something loosen in my chest, some knot of terror that had been clenched so tight I'd forgotten it was there. The thing didn't hunt in daylight. I'd noticed that pattern, even if I didn't understand it. Whatever rules governed its existence, the sun was one of them. Boone made it through surgery, 3 broken ribs, severe lacerations, internal bleeding that the vet said should have killed him. But he was stable and awake, and when I went back to see him, he tried to stand up, tried to come to me despite the tubes and the bandages and the drugs, making his eyes glassy and unfocused. I sat with him for 3 hours, my forehead pressed against his, telling him he was a good boy, the best boy, that he'd saved my life and I'd never forget it. I didn't report the attack. What would I have said? That a werewolf broke into my motel room and tried to kill me? That my dog fought it off while I emptied a rifle into something that should have died but didn't? The sheriff would have had me committed. My brother would have been right about the breakdown, about needing professional help, about losing my grip on reality, and worse than that, worse than being called crazy, was the thought of someone official investigating, poking around, drawing the thing's attention to other people who didn't deserve to be caught up in whatever nightmare had claimed me. So I told no one. Let the motel owner think a bear broke in. Let the doctors think I was covering for something. Maybe a fight. Maybe an accident I was too embarrassed to explain. Let everyone think whatever they wanted, as long as they left me alone. The transfer to Virginia came through 5 days later. I loaded everything I owned into my truck, which wasn't much anymore, just clothes and tools and a dog who could barely walk. And I drove out of West Virginia with the windows down and the radio off, watching the mountains shrink in my rear-view mirror. I didn't stop until I crossed the state line, didn't breathe easy until I was 50 miles from the hollow where I'd grown up, the cabin where I'd lived, the woods where something ancient and hungry had decided I was worth hunting. The new job was a day shift position at a smaller mine, less pay, fewer hours. Nothing like the seniority I'd built up over 15 years. But it was in town, a real town, with street lights and neighbors and traffic that never fully stopped, even at 3 a.m. I rented a duplex 2 blocks from Main Street, a place with thin walls and nosy landlords and not a single tree visible from any window. Rusty and May I'd given to Earl before I left. They were coon hounds, born to run the ridges, and they'd have withered in town. Earl promised to keep them safe, and I had to believe he would. I adopted 2 more dogs from the shelter, a German Shepherd named Duke and a Mastiff mix named Bella, and I trained them all to sleep in my bedroom with the doors locked. The first month was the hardest. I couldn't sleep for more than 2 hours at a stretch. Every sound woke me up, a car door slamming, a neighbor's television, a dog barking 3 streets over, and I'd lie there in the dark with my rifle across my chest, waiting for eyes to appear in the window, for the smell to seep under the door, for the nightmare to follow me into this new life I was trying to build. I lost 15 pounds I couldn't afford to lose. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold a coffee cup. The guys at the new mine looked at me sideways and whispered things they thought I couldn't hear. Burnout, breakdown, maybe something worse. But the thing didn't follow me. Not across the state line, not into town, not into the lit spaces where the darkness couldn't reach. Whatever rules bound it, territory maybe, or something else I didn't understand, They kept it in the hollow, in the mountains, in the wild places where humans were just visitors who'd overstayed their welcome. I started to breathe again, started to sleep at least a little, started to believe that I might survive this, that I might build something like a normal life on the ashes of everything I'd lost. Then I saw the news about the hikers. 2 college kids from Morgantown, out for a weekend camping trip in the Appalachians, last seen heading into the backcountry near the hollow where I used to live. The search teams found their campsite 3 days later. Gear shredded, blood everywhere, no bodies. The official explanation was bear attack, same as always. And I watched the TV reporter standing at the trailhead with her microphone and her serious expression, and I wanted to scream. I didn't warn them, didn't tell anyone what really lived in those woods. And now 2 kids were dead or worse because I couldn't figure out a way to explain the truth that anyone would believe. That guilt lives in me still. A permanent resident, like the scars on my back and the way I flinch at certain sounds. I could have said something, could have found a way to make someone listen, to post warnings online, to do anything other than run and hide and hope it would leave me alone. But I was scared. I'm still scared. And some nights, when the moon is full and the shadows seem darker than they should be, I wonder if my silence makes me complicit in whatever happens next. It's been 18 months now. I still work at the mine in Virginia, still live in the duplex with the thin walls and the street lights outside every window. Boone's scars healed wrong. The fur never grew back right, leaving pink ridges of tissue that catch the light when he moves. But he runs again, plays again, sleeps at my feet like nothing happened. Duke and Bella have never seen what he's seen, never fought what he fought, and I hope they never will. They're just dogs, happy and oblivious, and their innocence is something I protect like it's precious, because it is. I check the locks 4 times before bed. I keep a rifle in every room, loaded, safety off, even though I know it probably wouldn't matter. I sleep maybe 4 hours a night, and the dreams that come are always the same. Yellow eyes in the darkness, watching, waiting, patient as stone. Sometimes I wake up and I'm standing at the window, hand on the glass, like I was trying to go somewhere I don't remember deciding to go. My brother calls once a week, asks how I'm doing. I tell him I'm fine, that the new job is good, that I'm thinking about dating again. All lies, carefully constructed, designed to keep him from worrying. He doesn't need to know what happened. No one does. The truth would only drag them into a darkness they're not equipped to survive. Some nights I drive past the hollow where I used to live. I don't know why. Some form of penance maybe, or a need to remind myself that it was real, that I didn't imagine the whole thing in some fugue state brought on by grief and loneliness. I never stop, never get out of the truck. Just slow down at the old logging road and stare into the trees, looking for eyes that might be looking back. I haven't seen them. Not yet. But I know the thing is still out there. Can feel it in my bones, in the scars it left on my back, in the way Boone still growls sometimes at nothing I can see. It's waiting, hunting, claiming whatever unlucky soul wanders into its territory next. And there's nothing I can do about it except survive and hope that's enough. People ask me sometimes why I moved, why I gave up the mountains, the hunting, the life I'd known since childhood. I tell them the truth, wrapped in a lie. The only way I know how to explain. Something in those woods didn't want me there. They nod like they understand, and they don't. They couldn't. The world they live in has rules that make sense, predators that can be named and killed and understood. The world I glimpsed that night, the world that lunged through my window with claws and teeth and eyes full of ancient intelligence. That world operates by different laws entirely. Laws I don't pretend to comprehend. I survived because a dog loved me more than he feared dying. That's the only truth I know for certain. The only thing I hold on to, when the darkness presses close and the dreams get too vivid to shake. Boone threw himself at a nightmare to give me 3 seconds to live. And I'm still here because of his courage, his loyalty, his refusal to let the thing have me without a fight. I don't know what it was. Werewolf, Dogman, something older than any name humans have given to the darkness. I've stopped trying to categorize it. Some things aren't meant to be understood. Some mysteries don't have answers, only survivors, and I'm one of the lucky ones. I got away with my life and my dog, and enough of my sanity to function in a world that has no place for what I know. The streetlights still hold back the dark. I cling to that some nights, when the moon is full and the shadows seem to move on their own. The light is safety. The light is civilization, with all its noise and chaos and beautiful mundane problems. I'll never walk in the woods again, never feel the silence that comes before the wrongness, never hear the sound of something massive moving between the trees. That part of my life is over, and I don't mourn it. Boone is sleeping at my feet as I write this, his breath slow and steady, his scars visible even in the lamplight. Duke and Bella are curled together in the corner, dreaming whatever simple dreams good dogs dream. And somewhere out there, in the darkness beyond the window, the moon is rising over mountains I'll never see again. I made it out. That's all that matters now. Not understanding, not explaining, not warning anyone who wouldn't believe me anyway. Just surviving, just living each day as it comes, checking the locks, watching the shadows, keeping my dogs close and my rifles closer. The thing in the hollow didn't get me. And as long as the streetlights hold, as long as Boone keeps watch, as long as I stay in the lit spaces where the ancient dark can't reach, it never will.